In this video lesson, we're on family, town, and church, and describe the problems that afflicted this comfortable social order in the late 17th century. We'll also describe family life and the roles of women in both the Southern and New England colonies, and indicate how these changed over the course of the 17th century. Slavery enriched masters, and the fruits of slave labor made England's southern colonies the richest in North America. By the 18th century, a distinctive social hierarchy of wealth and status had emerged in the southern colonies. Great merchant planters, the grandees, occupied the top of the social pyramid, families who owned vast acres of land and gangs of slaves to work it. Among these merchant planters were the Fitzhughs, Lees, Custis, and Washingtons of Virginia, the so-called first families of Virginia. FFVs established before 1690 in Virginia's Tidewater region, who dominated the House of Burgesses, Virginia's lawmaking body. These merchant planters controlled the economies and politics in their colonies and were hard-working businessmen who closely managed their plantations. Next in the social pyramid were the small yeoman farmers, those with smaller acreages who lived a subsistence lifestyle, worked on their own land, and owned a few, if any, slaves. Privately, the big planters looked down on the lesser yeoman farmers, but treated them as equals publicly. Yeoman farmers generally resented the planters, but appreciated the occasional favors and social order they maintained. Below the yeoman farmers were landless white settlers, former indentured servants who were now free, with little money and few prospects of rising higher in the South's social pyramid. Next in the hierarchy came indentured servants, working off their contracts to their masters, followed by African slaves at the very bottom of the South's social pyramid. Life in the 17th century in New England contrasted starkly with life in the South. The North's cooler climate and purer water enabled settlers to enjoy longer lifespans with fewer threats from epidemics of disease. Among New England's first Puritan settlers, lifespans averaged 70 years for males and slightly less for females, an increase of 10 years over lifespans in Old England. The primary determinant of a woman's lifespan was childbirth. Women averaged 10 pregnancies, of which 8 children survived. This translated to nearly 1 baby every 2 years until menopause. In New England, childbirthing and childcare was a full-time task, a role which filled women with fears of dying in childbirth, which physically drained them. One reason for a woman's near-total submission to her husband can best be expressed in a sentiment then common in Europe and America: a true wife accounts, subjection her honor. Despite risks of childbirth and life in frontier New England, the longevity of New Englanders contributed to family stability. It was common for children to grow up knowing both their parents and their grandparents. Family stability contributed to low premarital pregnancy rates and a strong social structure. Women's property rights in New England differed from those in the South. In New England, men lived longer and retained rights to all property because lawmakers believed recognizing a woman's separate property rights would undermine marital unity. Divorces were very rare and were generally granted only for abandonment or adultery. A woman convicted of adultery was usually whipped and forced to wear an A sewn into her outer clothing. New England's growing population competed for a limited amount of land because Indian tribes fiercely guarded their lands against encroachment along the western and northern borders. Over time, it became the practice for town councils to request land grants from the colonial legislatures to move families wishing to establish new towns. Towns consisting of 50 families or more were required in New England to establish a tax-supported elementary school to teach children reading, writing, and to study the Bible. Towns also had a meeting house, which served as both town hall and a place of worship. These meeting houses were surrounded by homes and a village green used for militia drills and other activities. Towns held meetings to elect officials, select schoolmasters, and handle routine business. Voting was limited to adult males. So in the picture here that represents a New England town, you can clearly see the meeting house, different houses, fields outside. You could see a tax-supported elementary school. You can see the stocks where people were punished. You can see a general store. You can see the town common. You can see a mill, and then other places where people worked and sold their skills. In 1636, Massachusetts Puritans established Harvard College to train young men for the ministry. New Englanders also developed trade networks, connecting them to Boston merchants, moneylenders, to Atlantic commerce, something they came to value very dearly. New England farmers grew a variety of small crops and raised livestock to meet their needs. If a surplus was produced, it was traded, sold to neighbors, or exported to other colonial markets or the wider Atlantic world. New Englanders were known for shipbuilding and fishing in the rich waters off Newfoundland. By the 18th century, fish constituted over 33% of its exports. They developed reputations for Puritanistic consciences, idealism, and for Yankee ingenuity. The Yankee ingenuity was an ability to improvise, invent, and make do in the tough northeastern climate. In the 1640s and 1650s, New England Puritan leaders began to express alarm at declining church membership and perceived that there was a watering down of Orthodox Puritan beliefs. They believed that because New England's population was growing, the dispersal of families to new towns weakened people's ties to church and neighbors, and there was a weakening of religious zeal associated with the first generation of Puritan colonists. In the 1650s, Puritan ministers tried to renew that zeal using the Jeremiad, a new form of sermon which berated parishioners for their declining piety and testimonials of personal conversion with God. In 1652, the Congregational Church adopted something called the Halfway Covenant, which was a solution that they hoped would help. It basically held that unconverted children became halfway members in the church without voting privileges. They could baptize their infants in the church, but could not take communion. The Halfway Covenant diluted distinctions between the elect and others, an unintended consequence which illustrated the difficulty of maintaining religious zeal. In time, Puritan churches relaxed their membership even more by welcoming all, whether converted or not, a fact corresponding to the rise of women as a majority in the church. Puritanism's failure to achieve complete success in fulfilling the promise of a godly society ultimately undermines it, and a fact is manifested and shown in the Salem witch trials of 1692. In 1692, more than 100 people were accused of witchcraft. Most were middle-class women from merchant families who were charged with worshiping Satan and bedeviling those who had accused them. The witch trials clearly illustrated the erosion of religious confidence. Poor people came to resent the wealth and sins of others more than they were concerned for their own sins. Their accusers came from poorer subsistence farm families on the town's outskirts. Of those accused of witchcraft, 20 were executed, most by hanging, and one was pressed to death. The majority of American settlers were farmers who worked from sunup to sundown, preparing and planting fields in the spring, tending crops in the summer, and harvesting in the fall. After dinner at sundown, they generally went to bed, unless there was important work to be done, and then only if it was worth the candle. On northern farms or southern plantations, women, slave or free, were responsible for cooking, cleaning, childcare, weaving, and other stereotypical women's work. Men handled the tasks of clearing land, planting, tending crops and livestock, cutting firework, and other typical men's work. Children helped if they were old enough. In northern and middle colonies, most white migrants came from neither the aristocracy nor the lowest classes of European citizenry, with the exception of the indentured servants. In frontier colonial America, displays of class were not welcomed and not followed. Particularly in the more egalitarian Middle and New England colonies is where you would see this class structure. Still, American settlers considered themselves different and of a better sort than those who remained in England or in Europe, pointing to their success in building a new social structure, modified through democratic influences, with elements of what was familiar from the Old World. Upper-class pretensions often generated resentment and fomented civil strife, such as Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, Leisler's Rebellion in New York from